I'd like to just start off by introducing Dr. Kim. Dr. Kim is an investigator at the VA Center for Healthcare Organization and Implementation Research and assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Kim directs the evaluation core of the VA Behavioral Health Quality Enhancement Research Initiative program and is the systems analysis lead for the implementation core of the VA Bridging the Care Continuum Query program. Her research interests are in applying interdisciplinary methodologies towards studying the quality and implementation of health and related services, such as her query grant in partnership with the VA Homeless Programs Office that evaluates the implementation of the VA's efforts to improve access to legal services for veterans. We're very excited to have Dr. Kim with us today. And she'll be talking with us today about adapting concepts and methods from other fields to strengthen implementation. So welcome, Bo, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So I am so excited to be here today and share with you and to hear from you really thoughts about adapting methods and concepts from other fields to be able to strengthen implementation. And as part of the discussion, I'll be referring to the Matrix Multiple Case Study, or MMCS. It's a method that my colleagues and I have devised by drawing on and adapting approaches that have origins outside of implementation science. So I'll be referring to that. And in light of that, let me go here. In light of that, I wanted to start by thanking my colleagues at the VA Behavioral Health Quality Enhancement Research Initiative Program, and also other colleagues who I've gotten to know and working closely with now through the Society for Implementation Research Collaboration, Implementation Research Institute, as well as other query networks. And in presenting today, I have no conflicts to report, and all views to be shared, of course, are my own. So when I received this invitation to participate in the seminar series, I was super excited for this chance to share with you and hopefully co-develop together some early thoughts on how to more systematically think about adapting approaches from other disciplines to be able to help advance implementation efforts. So depending on how today's conversation goes, I am hoping that we might have an opportunity to together facilitate the field's thinking on this matter a little more beyond just today's seminar. And as a field of study grows, let's say implementation science, I think it is really common for certain words in the, let's say, human language to take on very specific meanings. So just for those who are really in the field, right? So I think adapt and implement are such words where adaptation makes us immediately think in implementation science about adapting certain interventions or implementation strategies. And then implementation, that word, I think immediately gets us to think about very specifically implementing an evidence-based practice or other innovation into routine use. So in setting up for today's discussion, I thought that it might be fun to go back to the dictionary to look at what it says adapt and implement mean in a more general sense and have that guide us in our thinking. So the dictionary told me that adapt is to make something fit as for a new use, and then implement means to take steps to accomplish something. So I think using those general definitions, I would like to really talk to you today about some considerations when we are trying to make fit various methods and concepts from other fields to help accomplish the conduct and the study of implementation. So today we'll begin with the rationale for why this may be a topic of interest to us, then eventually wrap up with brainstorming some future directions as well for this line of thinking. And I'm happy to, discuss and address comments as we go. And also knowing that this may be one of the last few Zoom meetings, hopefully, that you have before the weekend starts, I would like to use a few, chat waterfalls to have everyone involved in the conversation this hour. So some of you may be familiar with chat waterfalls already, so please excuse me if this may be a repeat. But essentially how it works is that I will ask a question and then to which you can type your answer into the chat box. and then don't press enter yet. And then when I say 3, 2, 1, go, then everyone will press enter at the same time. So that's what chat waterfalls are. And let's actually give it a practice question just to see whether it actually works all right for use during the presentation today. So the practice question is, and especially given today's topic, I'm really curious to know, in which field or fields of study is your academic background? So once again, if you could type your answer into the chat box, but don't press enter yet. I'll just give people a few more seconds here. Just brought up my chat box here. So I will count down now. So 3, 2, 1, go. So if you could all press enter. Wow. Okay. I'm so glad to see it. It's like a waterfall. That's why it's called chat waterfall. But I hope you all will also scroll through as well to sort of see where people are coming from. And oh my goodness, it's so nice to see people from so many different backgrounds here. If it was, primarily one or the other, et cetera, I was going to say, oh, I'm going to have to pick on you to ask about this, et cetera. But there are so many different ones here. So I guess that means I can pick on everyone. But thank you. I'll keep these fields in mind, and I'm still scrolling. Really nice to see a nice collection from so many different fields being represented here. I think it'll be a rich discussion. Thank you. So we'll use this chat waterfall a few times during the talk today, but also I'll keep in mind the time as well. So if we are running short, we don't have to do each of the few that I've planned. All right. So let's see. Let's first start with then the rationale. So why does implementation science look to adapt approaches from other disciplines? There may be many reasons, and I'd love to hear from you about those too. But those that first came to mind for me are in the realms of understanding implementation contexts, making implementation decisions, and then examining implementation phenomena. So in those areas, I think implementation science really has been active in trying to learn from other fields as to what they have done in terms of their established methods. So in terms of understanding implementation context, we know from having implemented or trying to implement different interventions and innovations into new settings, there are multiple challenges, and I could only list really a few here, but there may be so many more. Organizational barriers might exist. There could be different relevant entities who are very resistant to something new being implemented, of course. And then needless to say, there always can be resource constraints as to doing something new and stop doing something that has been being done, right? So those are all very important considerations. Now, even more important perhaps is that oftentimes these things don't stand alone, but have complex interplays with one another too. So whether they are some of these individual factors like resistance and other things, or other factors at the organizational or cultural or even larger levels, I think the ways in which they interact with one another could be also very meaningful and sometimes difficult to understand. And I think implementation science has really benefited from and continues to learn a lot from other fields that have specialized in looking into certain things like this, such as, and this is just one example, but from organizational psychology, I think understandings of roles of leadership or how the different organizational cultures could play a role, dynamics of teams that exist within those organizations. I think implementation science has and will continue to benefit from really drawing on the rich pool of knowledge from that particular field. Now, in terms of making implementation decisions, there are many, right? If we try to go and get new practice taken up and promoted, et cetera, then really, I think thinking about who's going to do what and where and how to make that happen. So in other words, the strategy of doing that needs some specification. And then there are so many considerations when deciding how to set those parameters, right? There could be cost considerations. There also has to be, of course, social acceptability. It has to fit with the culture of the setting and the different sites at which implementation is being done. And again, because there are so many of these pieces, I think it's so beneficial and we're able to make decisions really based on hard data that's available. And I think by no means is implementation science the only field that's wanting to learn from data, right? This is very common, but one example that I wanted to mention, really, I think we've been benefiting a lot from economics and how they think about sort of return on investment, the effort that we put into implementation, what does that really get us? Using that kind of information and data from the past to be able to strategize which strategy to move forward with versus not, or maybe we change that later on based on how that is changing over time. I think all of those issues connected connected with resource allocation, et cetera, we are increasingly, I think, focusing on economic analyses and things that we can draw from directly from that field and related fields. So we think about context, we go and make decisions about how implementation will be done. And then, of course, there's the part of examining what happens, right? All the implementation phenomena. So one part of this is outcomes, but there are other things too, contexts that change because of implementation efforts, otherwise referred to also as determinants and other things that could take place here. So in terms of desired outcomes, there could be, you just want to look at how much adoption has happened, how much fidelity it has to the original model of the intervention or the implementation strategy that was planned. And then over time, what happens in terms of sustainment of that? How can it scale to other places and other settings? So there are a lot of phenomena that we're interested in observing. And importantly, I think not just observing it from one angle. And by the way, I haven't used the word multi-angle before in anything that I've said, but I put multi-level here first. But the more I think about it, I think multi-level to me still seems quite unidimensional. It kind of seems, bottom to up, whereas multi-angle, I was hoping in using this word, it really brings to light that even at the same level, there are multiple angles from which we can look at any of these phenomena. And therefore, I think deliberately using this word, you all can tell me whether it works or not later. But so multi-angle views, of course, individually, some of their relationships with one another could also change as to what kind of phenomena take place. And then, of course, at the different levels that we're just talking about in angles, organizational, systemic, et cetera. So I think because there are so many things that can be looked at, once again, it's very helpful to be able to see how these different components are interconnected. Again, only one example out of many, but from the fields of sociology and mathematics, I think I've seen some cool studies that really try to do a social network analysis, trying to better understand who exactly are these entities that are in these different systems that are working from different angles and levels, and then trying to see whether their connections and interconnections make a difference in the way in which innovations get diffused, get taken up, get into routine practice, et cetera. So again, for each of these, right, there are ways in which fields outside of implementation science really has and will continue to help implementation science as a field move forward. So I've talked about better understanding implementation contexts, making implementation decisions, as well as examining implementation phenomena and how it can really benefit from other methods. So what I haven't talked about explicitly yet is how implementation science draws on or could further benefit from approaches that other fields use to disseminate implementation findings. So I actually wanted to make that our first non-practice chat waterfall. So the question here is, what concepts or methods from other fields that you know about might be helpful for disseminating implementation findings? It's fine if it's something that's already being widely used, or it can be something specific or more broad. But let's think about that for a second, and would love to hear from you about methods that might be used more widely outside of implementation science, at least as of now, that could be helpful for disseminating findings from implementation research. Give everyone just about 30 seconds or so more. And again, please type your answer into the chat box without pressing enter yet. All right, I think we're ready to count down. 3, 2, 1, go. It's so great to see these ideas. I think I'm seeing different types of media, social media and otherwise pop up. Of course, we can learn a lot from kind of the marketing and business world. I'm seeing kind of epidemiology, kind of the causal understandings. Yes, like mapping at the systems level, ethnographic methods. Yes, evidence-based teaching. Yes, once again, systems related. I love this targeted persuasive messaging piece. I think I need to actually build some of that in for talking to some funders next week. So I'll have to think about this. Health literacy, for sure. For sure, I'm paying attention to who's able to understand what kind of information in what ways. A lot of communication science can help as well, different engagement approaches, etc. So thank you. Thank you so much. It's so great to be able to see these ideas. And I really mean it when I think I need to think carefully after talking with you all today about how I'm going to best prepare to share some findings that I have to do immediately next week. So thank you for sharing these great ideas, and we can talk more about them as we open up for discussion later. So there are these ways in which, and good reason for implementation science to adopt and use approaches that are more established in other fields. So I think the natural question, at least for me, and again, would love to hear your thoughts. The next question for me that comes to mind is, how does that adapting and applying actually happen? So when I ask that question, I'd like to actually distinguish that a little bit from the details of how an already adapted method works really well in implementation science. Where I'm hoping to go with this question actually is a little more of the process of adapting in terms of what the impetus is, what considerations are accounted for, and perhaps what aspects are tried, perhaps abandoned, or refined before a method actually moves forward in implementation science. So I think understanding such a, let's say, journey, as I will later refer to, is important for us to be able to understand what has been tried so that it is not repeated again unless there's good reason to, and also to help not reinvent the wheel, since we would be able to more clearly see the journey that an adaptation has taken and which paths it has or has not explored in being brought into implementation science. So as a very rough first conceptualization of this adaptation journey, should I say, it was helpful for me in preparing for this presentation to think back on the matrix multiple case study as an example of how my colleagues and I drew from existing approaches outside of implementation science strictly to make MMCS usable for implementation science. So the particular phases in the journey that I will refer to are identifying a need, selecting concepts and methods, synthesizing, adapting and integrating, and pilot testing and refining. And then really through each of these phases, collaborating and obtaining feedback from co-developers as well as external experts. So to use MMCS as an example, I thought it would be helpful to provide just a super brief overview of what it is. Happy to talk about it more. So it is an evaluative method where it really tries to answer not just what happens on average, but what works for whom and how. So at the center of the method is a formalized sequence of steps, all the way from establishing a research goal of conducting that cross-site or multi-site study as to what happens where, and how, and then all the way to analyzing across those sites where some of the similarities as well as heterogeneities may be. And then it really centers around a concrete data structure, which we refer to as the matrix. And the idea is really to be able to bring together different types of data from different sources to make it sortable and filterable so that we can both look for patterns that we are expecting to see, as well as identify different patterns as to what kind of factors might be influencing or associated with successful or less successful implementation. So that's MMCS just at a glance. But with that, we started with this first phase of identifying a need for this type of method. So how did we even think that we needed something, that we needed to devise something? So again, we were dealing with information and data from a multi-site trial. Heterogeneities were abundant, ubiquitous, everywhere. And we also understood that to be the case for multiple other studies as well. So we wanted to not just ignore them or consider them as noise, but really be able to think about a way in which we can leverage the understandings we're getting from different sites and different contexts. We also knew that what is common already also in the field is multi-site studies are common, and being able to assess and trying to look for how one setting differs from a different setting, or one site differs from a different site, I think really is common too. So it's not new that there's cross-site variation that is assessed for these multi-site implementation efforts. What we found to be less common is really very specifically defined protocols that can be applicable to more than just one study at a high enough level and with a consistency enough that it can work with different types of data. It can also work with different types of conceptual groundings. As some of you may be familiar with in implementation science, I think it's very common to be aligning our work that we do to a framework, for example, a model or theory, etc. So how can such a process of going about assessing these variations across multiple settings happen in a procedure that's applicable to more than one type of framing or one type of data? So we wanted to see some consistency there. So we thought that it was more than, really necessary to be able to do so, so that we can eventually be able to compare and consolidate findings across studies and see whether there are generalizable findings or lessons that we can take away, not just from one trial, but really because we have used consistent procedures from multiple trials as well. And totally understanding that each study is different, each site is different, each context is so, so different. We are not going to say there's not going to be variation in how these steps are used, but rather that it needs to be documented and be very transparent. So we can attribute some of the differences or understand that some of the differences that we see across settings or across contexts might be arising from some of these variations. So we thought there was a need to sort of approach this, an approach that allows us to protocol out in a way how we might go about looking at different site differences. So that was the identifying the need. And then the second phase was, now that we knew we wanted to do that, we had to go look at selecting some concepts and methods to draw from. So here is where we thought, okay, we want to answer this question of what works for whom and how. What kind of fields of thought or groups of methodologies have really put a lot of time already into doing this? And our colleagues thankfully pointed us to case study research. And there are many schools of this as well, as my understanding. The particular one that our team drew on was Robert Yin's case study research methodologies and the implications of that. So happy to discuss what it might mean if it was different, but that's what we drew on. And so it was really encouraging to see that those research methods are specifically useful for answering these how or why type of questions, especially as we're seeing these heterogeneities. And then also good if we have limited control over kind of the data that we get to work with. And as many of us may know, yes, we might try to implement something and we might be able to make some things to go the way we want, but there are so many things when it comes to implementation that are just outside of our control. So being able to really document that, learn from that, even if it's not what we've planned, I thought was also a very happy reason to use this case study research. And then, of course, the fact that we're dealing with contemporary events. There, of course, are many historical, great case study research that's possible too. But the fact that we're talking about contemporary events, just the context in which we're able to understand the ongoing implementation, the way we're able to see whether other data sources are possible, et cetera, I think really also highlights how this could be a good way to use what case study research and that realm of thought have developed. So that was one piece. And then I mentioned to you kind of this protocoling out exactly what is done so that even if there are variations across different studies or across how it's looked at, we're able to track that, right? We're able to track that and consolidate across different studies. So that, and drawing from my engineering background as well, we went to process analysis. So business areas and operations research, et cetera, they have really spent a lot of time thinking about how to analyze, how to specify, how to optimize processes, right? So we wanted something that we can use to delineate each step of what the analysis is going to be, promoting some kind of standardization at that high level of processing this out, of course, while allowing variations, as I've been mentioning. So that was one other school of thought. And then the next piece had to do with, okay, there's going to be a lot of heterogeneities. We want to be able to look at and be able to see patterns. And to that, we thought really importantly, probably we should draw on this data visualization advancements, right? There are so many things out there, which actually, to be frank, we haven't really leveraged, I don't think, fully yet in our MMCS development group. I think there's so much that can be done in terms of putting the data together, curating in a way that just the visualization of it already helps people understand what some of those trends might be. So our hope in doing and putting together such a matrix at the center of the project was coming from kind of this visualization field of thought. And then I think going forward too, we'd like to figure out how best to leverage that for better presentations of findings and things like that too. So that was sort of the selecting of the concepts, thinking about ways in which we can already draw from things that are out there for what we need. The third phase then got into, okay, we specified these things that we think are useful for what we're trying to do. We got to now put them together, right? So the synthesizing, adapting, and actually integrating it into the project right at hand, I think was our next task. So drawing from, once again, process analyses, we went about and specified these specific steps of the MMCS, the matrix multiple case study. So once again, it starts all the way from specifying a research question, defining exactly what success of implementation might be, and then looking at potential influences deciding which kind of conceptual guiding frameworks, for example, to use, et cetera. So leaving room open for there to be variability, but asking the research team to really specify what those might be. So oftentimes, I think all of these steps happen during a research project. We just wanted to formalize it so that it is just a little bit at least, less interpretive, and how we can see different studies connect to these different steps as well. So the central sort of matrix that I've been talking about, what you see on the screen is sort of a schematic for it. So we are able to kind of look at different data sources, what the different data sources say about potential influencing factors that are associated with implementation outcome, et cetera. So we try to curate it in a way that's, again, easily sortable. We can filter it, et cetera. So we can look at it for each site. We can look at it for a group of sites, for example, all in a particular region, et cetera. Or we can group it by the level of implementation success, et cetera. And bringing all this data together, kind of, drawing on visualization concepts once again, right? It readied us to then be able to draw on that case study research piece to really practice what they have developed in terms of triangulating across multiple data sources to get at our answer, trying to see whether there are matching patterns across different sites or different settings. If they don't match, then being able to come up with explanations that we then can, through a subsequent study, be able to test whether our theorizing of why those things we see that are different or the same are that way could be actually looked and examined further. So this was the synthesizing, adapting, and integrating part of pulling together these different schools of thought. And then pilot testing and refining. And this, in a way, is kind of an always ongoing type of a step. So MMCS, as initially devised, was, as I just mentioned to you. And then as we're using it in each of our projects and connecting with people who might be interested in using it and seeing it used by other people who we haven't connected with, but thankfully they saw it somewhere and decided to incorporate it. They always talk about, the limitations of the method or why it was useful for certain things, like creating the matrix, but it wasn't useful for actually moving forward with putting it into a computational program that they needed to run. Or there are different ways in which something was more vague or needs to be specified. So we're continuing to want to learn from this and refining the method. And then the very rightmost sort of table/figure you're seeing there, it's not really meant for us to read verbatim, but just wanted to show once again, kind of from a visualization angle, our latest piece that's in press right now that has used this to look at the sustainability of an evidence-based, interdisciplinary, team-based care model in general mental health care settings. It came up with this type of a data visualization of what the MMCS findings were, where the darker boxes are supposed to point towards factors that seem to matter more than the others to differentiate between sites that did sustain the practice longer than not. But as I mentioned earlier, we're continuing to want to evolve and looking for feedback, et cetera, on how this might go. So that's sort of the pilot testing and refining phase, should I say, of the journey that I'm talking to you about, and bringing and adapting methods from other fields. So before I just turn back to the journey, actually, and we'll talk mostly about that for the remainder here, but wanted to just put in a plug for other upcoming work for MMCS in case you're interested in learning more, et cetera. Would love to discuss with you, kind of exploring the synergies that MMCS has with other methods and complementarity with them, et cetera. Definitely in our list of to-dos, and are actively pushing that forward next. We're also interested in seeing whether, given sort of the systematic way in which we lay out the different pieces that take part in implementation per setting, per site, per study, et cetera, whether there's a way in which examining those cross-site things can help us look at these mechanisms or the processes or events through which the strategies actually work. I think there's increased dialogue about mechanisms in the field right now, so we're curious to see whether MMCS has a role to play there. And then I think you might have guessed that I was going to say this. I am excited about exploring some tools and technology-enabled tools to make this type of method, right, more user-friendly and at the fingertips of the users. So thinking about platforms that can be really user-friendly in terms of generating such matrices. So if you have study data, you want to see whether this might point you to any trends, et cetera. Is there like a platform where we can go to and be able to plug this in, have an initial data matrix generation already, and be able to be on a good, take a good step towards visualization and analysis. So those are sort of a few dimensions in which we're thinking specifically about MMCS within our development group. But that was just a quick plug for MMCS and next steps. Here's a potential QR code in case you're interested in learning more. And we will make available, of course, additional papers that become available on this topic too. So as I promised, though, I will pull back and talk again about this journey. So we talked about, and especially in light of MMCS, using MMCS as an example, we got to see how this was applied and being able to, I think, see successful adaptations of various approaches that work in implementation science is common. And I just like the examples I shared earlier from organizational psych or otherwise, we can see how they're successfully applied. But I am actually not sure, speaking of this journey, right? I am not sure that there are many structured ways in which we have the opportunity to learn about and learn from these types of journeys that adapted methodologies have taken. So it may, for example, show up in some extent to within a journal article, let's say, that first introduces an adapted method. But beyond that, I'm not sure whether there's an easy way for us to transparently understand the adaptation journey that could really potentially help maximize efficiencies in the future, right, of continued adaptations or future adaptations, preventing, once again, the same mistakes from being made or not reinventing the wheel, etc. So here comes, with that in mind, here comes the second chat waterfall. Third, I guess, if you count the practice one as well. So how might we better document and share journeys such as this? So the journey of adaptation, right? How do we share this, these adapting concepts and methods from other fields to be able to strengthen implementation and share this information across the field? What might be some ways, specific or general, both are okay. But let's take a few seconds here to think about this. And if you could type your thoughts into the chat box and wait to press enter, that would be great. All right, let's see what everyone's thoughts are. 3, 2, 1, go. And let's all take a moment to read what others have said as well. And that's my selfish way of saying I'd like to read these answers now. So please, let's all take a look. I love the ideas that are coming up. I'm seeing discussions of needing to tailor specific instruments, being able to use different journals, interdisciplinary journals. Yes, and more options for being able to share this kind of thinking through journals, not necessarily specifically only on outcomes. Yes, I love the idea of having a space to share this kind of information, whether it's a website, toolkit, that's a great idea. Of course, yes, through publications. And again, I think this relates to the idea of there being venues available to share and openly think together through these ideas. I love the blueprints methods idea as well, kind of ways in which we might be able to standardize some of that discussion or build some structure around it, I should say, not standardize. And then transparency, of course. Yes, again, kind of venues to share, methods, case studies, for sure, communities of practice. Wow, I think these are all really great ideas. Thank you once again. And I think this might relate so directly to a few slides later when I talk about future approaches as to where we might go from here to be able to better document and understand and learn from these journeys that different adaptations have taken. So thank you. I'm learning so much, and we can talk about any one or more of these later too as we open up for discussion. So with that, I thought, building on these exchanged thoughts, right, I thought it might be helpful to briefly talk about now just a few cases, and briefly, I really intend to talk about a few cases of approaches more widely used in other fields that are now being increasingly, or have been for some time now, used in exciting ways in implementation science. So the first is systems analysis. So this is an area that's very dear to me, and it really thinks a lot about how different entities within networks or systems might be interrelated, how they might be interdependent, how the systems themselves might be related to one another, and all the complexities that are surrounding that situation is what systems analysis tries to get at. And practically speaking, I think it really draws on both qualitative as well as quantitative modeling techniques to understand map out and see where those interconnections might be so that implementation-related decision-making can happen in a more efficient and effective way. So if we change a lever here, then what is it going to impact? Not just that, right? All the ways in which it's interdependent with other levels or other angles of systems, I think could play a role here. So try to do that in a very collaborator, input inducing and participation oriented way. So that's what I think of when I think of systems analysis. And I think increasingly, thankfully, thanks to many colleagues who are working on this as well, we are trying to make some headway as to how this could help implementation science. Just wanted to do a shameless plug. So several of my close colleagues and I just put out a piece, maybe the third or fourth quarter, I guess, of 2023. So if you're interested in kind of how we were thinking specifically about systems analysis methods, explicitly for examining implementation mechanisms. I briefly mentioned the mechanisms earlier as sort of the event-specific processes or events by which strategies are seen to work or not work. So please check this piece out. But for systems analysis methods, I think there's a lot of room for where it can be even more than it has been done till this point being used. I'm, of course, biased in saying this, being a systems analyst myself. So I think the next few that I'll mention actually are areas that I actually haven't directly used in my own work, but if any of you are experts in this, I would love to talk to you more about it because I'm actually considering getting to learn about their journeys. It would be really great, and I wasn't able to easily find that, so putting it out there in case you all know. But I think one area, of course, is behavioral economics, so understanding sort of the biases, the heuristics, and the norms that really shape human behavior, I think is the focus of this, and strategies for implementation such as nudges and prompts and different kinds of incentives that really draw on this field's knowledge, I think have been helpful for being able to implement different effective interventions. There are many examples out here, and as I was practicing and preparing for today's talk, I was able to see that there are so many examples, but I found the ones that are most exciting to be in the realm of sort of education settings, getting both kind of the teaching entities as well as the learning entities to pick up education interventions that are evidence-based using these nudges and prompts. And I think a lot of the origins of implementation work that draw on these come from that field, is my understanding. So I think it's continuing to be very important to implementation science, and would love to see the journey that it has taken to get to this point here. I think some of these were mentioned earlier on as we were talking about sort of the participatory research approaches that were mentioned in the chat box as well. But participatory action research, I mean, I think it has found such a good home in implementation science, and would love to, of course, hear if you have other additional thoughts about this, but really thinking about settings and where implementation work is done, people there to really become co-researchers or co-designers or co-implementers of this, being able to really embed the important practices into those sites. I think this really draws from just even outside of implementation science, all the community development work that has been done, a lot of fields that have been actively using this has been the reason why I think it has been effectively adopted into implementation science. So being able to learn from how something like this has been done could set a good pathway for other methods to follow as well, thinking about its applicability to implementation science, etc. And then this, I think, is exciting. Again, I know there may be some of you who have used this sort of global or geographic information systems. I think it's super useful. And I think we saw a lot of this pop up during COVID-19 as well, in terms of mapping and quantifying specific patterns geographically to see where there may be disparities, for example, in terms of healthcare access or different kinds of services or amenities that are available, et cetera. So this can really, together with kind of the cost effectiveness and other economics driven methods that we talked about earlier, I think it can really inform allocation of where different implementation efforts should go and how the different resources that are available should be put towards underserved areas. So again, I think one method and a collection of methods, I should say, that really have been, I think, embraced, and for good reason, by implementation science. And I would love to know the journey that this has taken as well, so that we can try to emulate the good pieces of that for sure. So the chat waterfall that's coming up now then is, I would like to know, given all these other methods that we've talked about, ways in which you think artificial intelligence-based approaches can be adapted to support implementation. And I must admit, this is, I think, the first talk that I'm giving where I explicitly ask about AI-related thoughts from my audience. And part of it is because I think because of all the hype, I think I was afraid of yet again generating just kind of a hypeful discussion, right? Like instead of ways in which it could be really useful. But I think the more and more we see AI get close to our daily lives and ways in which it can really be useful, even from basic synthesis of information to generating new knowledge, et cetera, I think along that spectrum, there must be ways in which it can be helpful for implementation. So sorry for the long preamble, but I just wanted to say it's the first time I'm kind of putting an AI-related question to my audience. I would love to hear what you have to say. You don't have to be an expert in AI by any means. You can think about like things that are close to us, ChatGPT and other things that that comes to mind when you think of AI. But how could those things be helpful and adapted in a meaningful way for implementation? So let's take a few seconds here to write into our chat boxes. Right, 3, 2, 1, go. And as I'm scrolling here, I'm scared that there may be major AI experts on the call, which is very possible here, given the interdisciplinary nature of our field. Yes, definitely. We are seeing it in terms of summary, being able to really look at information that is less structured that might have been difficult to look at in the past. Looking for, I guess, consolidation of different ways in which we can run prediction algorithms for determinants that matter. Yes, I think analyzing unstructured information like free text, et cetera, really seem to be coming up a lot. Yes, definitely. I think it can do a great job in terms of finding patterns, things that we might not have been able to notice without that analytic power. And therefore, in light of that, being able to support decision making based on more data, more accurately synthesized data, et cetera. And I love the part about really analyzing and thinking about unanticipated questions. Like they could formulate questions that are likely to come up. We can be prepared for those, et cetera. Mapping of resources. And yes, thank you so much for sharing these ideas. I think these are really wonderful ways in which we can move forward and really harnessing the information that we're able to have. And I don't think it'll be in just one format that AI impacts us going forward. So if we are able to, be in time to set forth kind of a thinking framework for this journey, right, then we'll really be able to harness what people have thought through as to what works well or what doesn't work well, what have they tried and didn't work, et cetera. That way we can share that knowledge, especially for something like AI that really the limits, it's hard to know, right, as to how much impact it'll have on implementation science going forward. Thank you. So despite all these cool ways in which we can continue to think about adapting from other fields, of course, there are challenges, and I don't think these will be new to any of us, but I think it's helpful to sort of explicitly think about them. And there may be ones that didn't first come to mind for me, but you all are experiencing as well as you're working interdisciplinarily and looking at different methods. So I think when it comes down to it, it really has to do with there needing to be good amount of effort, so time and resources, to be able to address specific things that are important to keep in mind when adapting the different approaches. So applicability, of course, right? In terms of when these fields of thought or schools of thought over long periods of time have established ways of applying an approach, there are assumptions that go along with that. So how do we make sure and understand what those are? And then along with that, of course, is assumptions about when those methods can work. What kind of data does it need and what kind of structure, what kind of validity, et cetera, is necessary to use that. So understanding that applicability piece, I think, takes time and extra study, and of course, resources to be able to do so. Outside of just thinking about the approaches themselves and the appropriateness of using them, I think there's this piece of communication. And this communication piece is not just about adapting methods, it's about just collaboration in general too, right? There definitely are differences in terminologies. We started today by just peeking into the dictionary about what adapt and implement mean to us. But there are differences in terminology. So how do you make sure that's on the same page? And then I think beyond just words or language or what we are trying to discuss, I think there definitely are dynamics between different disciplines. So there are more, should I say, dominant disciplines. Whether everyone agrees on what those dominant ones are or not is a whole different matter. But I think there are perspectives about disciplines that are more dominant because they have been around longer, or they are making a bigger splash right now, or for other reasons. So kind of filling in those things where it really is about finding the right ways to look at appropriateness and not just driven by the more dominant schools of thought, I think is also very important. And technology. I don't think we need to say too much more about this. We just talked a lot about AI and things like that, but really the rapid pace of advancement, I think, is what is challenging here. I mean, next week, there could be something new where I come and say, oh, AI has already been applied and we just learned about it, in a different way. So I think just the keeping up with the pace, keeping up with, yes, is this really the latest, most efficient way to do things given the available technology? I think is difficult. And when we make a change to a new one, of course, the additional required training, the additional change in infrastructure, et cetera. So once again, I think it's the effort, a good amount of effort that's really needed if we want to appropriately adapt and along our themes today, appropriately document and be transparent about how we are adapting the different methods into our work. So I talk about here kind of applicability, communication, as well as technology as potential sort of potential challenges here. Anything else that comes to mind? And I promise this is the last chat waterfall. Thank you all for being so involved during our conversation today. But what may be some other challenges to appropriately adapting concepts and methods from other fields? There's that applicability piece, communication, as well as technology that just first came to mind for me, but I'm sure there are more. Hey, let's see. 3, 2, 1, go. Yes, I think there are. Lack of team science that may be happening, ways in which there could be bias playing into the role, ways in which there are certain schools of thought as to how these types of methods should be developed, whether in tandem with specific applications, otherwise. Definitely terminology is coming up. Alignment of values, I think it's a huge one for sure. And different perspectives, not just across disciplines, but as this comment box mentions, really across different entities that are involved as well. Yes, and really the adequacy of having the right people available to talk at the table, right, about this is important too. We are, in a way, we are most used to getting the expertise and knowledge of people right around us. So how do we make sure that can not exist right there? And I love the redundancies piece. And I think kind of the reinventing the wheel part that I referred to earlier, I think is a big consideration. I am sorry for not being able to go through all the and verbalize all the great comments here, but let's keep these in mind as we continue to develop these thoughts even beyond today. All right, so future directions. I think these are kind of embedded, or should I say overarching some of the great ideas you've already offered. So training and networks, of course, like interdisciplinary trainings, already many are underway, but specifically, I think in thinking about methods, the applicability, et cetera, I think it'll be really helpful to be able to do so. Networks wise, I think, professional networks, all of them are meaningful, but especially as we're thinking about different ways in which kind of culturally or just a history of methods development wise, just different geographic areas also have different experiences with this and which they tend to turn to versus not. So I think this global collaboration, I think really could be helpful. Funding priorities, any research agenda setting or next step setting, I think can't be done without this. And I think we saw some chat box items related to this as well, but is there a way to really encourage very consistent transparency in proposals that are saying they're going to adapt from other fields and adopt and use within implementation centers? So how can we help create that structure together? And then I perhaps didn't mention this enough times today, but I think only in the sense that it really, I think, is a ubiquitous and really should be considered in every single aspect of what we talked about today, is equity. So in terms of asking people to specify why they are drawing on something or why they are needing to come up with a new way of doing something within implementation science, can specific rationale be required of them to really say specifically that a conceptual or methodological adaptation is going to enhance equitable implementation of interventions, which I think as a field, we're moving more and more towards, which I'm very happy about. So I think those are pieces we definitely want to think along the lines of. So just as a recap, we kind of set out the agenda today to think together about considerations in making various methods and concepts from other fields to help accomplish implementation efforts. I shared this idea, again, a very rough one, of this journey, right, of needing to think about how explicitly we are identifying the need for adaptations, how we're going about in selecting the concepts, how do we actually document these steps that take place, all the way to the method actually being successfully used in implementation. I used MMCS as an example, happy to discuss that more with you. And then I think the most fun part for me, I hope it wasn't too much effort on your ends, was to kind of brainstorm together really about each of these pieces today. So I really, really appreciate your participation through the chat box. And to the organizers, I am very sorry. I know that over email, I promised I will leave like 10 minutes for discussion, and I'm just noticing that I have broken that promise. So my sincere apologies. I had too much fun going through all the shared ideas, but let me turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bo. This was a terrific talk. Thank you so much. And I just want to say, for me, what I loved is that you took us through your journey, because so many of us work in teams and try to think about how we can learn from other disciplines and integrate that into our work to better understand and synthesize some of what we learn from our projects. And it was just very cool to see how you explained your journey and just some of the new ways, the innovative ways in which we're borrowing and using and integrating different strategies from other fields. I think that's incredibly important for keeping implementation science close to the context, which can often be very dynamic and needs, methods and strategies from other fields, but also keeps us innovative and sort of pushing the envelope and challenging ourselves. So thank you for this incredible talk. This was great.